So, Sonoma Land Trust is a local nonprofit that protects land in Sonoma County for everyone's benefit. We've been doing this work since 1976 and have protected nearly 60,000 acres in our county so far. We accomplish our work through the generosity of our members and contributors. And so, thanks to all of you out there who are helping us protect beautiful Sonoma County for future generations. And as we pursue our mission of conserving land in Sonoma County, we recognize that we stand upon the unceded ancestral lands of many Indigenous people. We honor their knowledge, their care, and their stewardship of this special place across the ages. And we acknowledge the deep and lasting damage that colonization has inflicted upon them. We embrace our responsibility to learn from and to protect their cultural and traditional connections to the land. So it is both a pleasure and an honor to introduce one of my personal heroes and a vital leader in the fight against anthropogenic climate change, Dr. Daniel Swain. I think his work is best described in his own words. I'm a physical scientist, but I not only study how the physics and thermodynamics of weather evolve, but how they affect people. I lead investigations into how extreme events like floods and droughts and wildfires are changing in a warming climate and what we might do about it. This emphasis makes him an indispensable guide for the conservation movement and beyond. Daniel holds joint appointments as a climate scientist with the University of California Agriculture and Natural Resources, the UCLA Institute of the Environment and Sustainability, and at the National Science Foundation's National Center for Atmospheric Research. He is considered the go-to climate expert for journalists in print, television, radio, and web-based outlets for his ability to make sense of complex weather events and data for the public. He has been a model of accessible and accurate coverage and the conversation surrounding climate change. Daniel's an alumnus of the University of California at Davis. Also, he did his doctorate at Stanford, and he completed his postdoctoral work at UCLA. He is also the author of the widely read Weather West blog, which provides real-time perspectives on California weather and climate, and which I strongly urge all of you to subscribe to get both the details of what's happening now and is thinking about future weather trends. He can also be found on Twitter, otherwise known as X, Blue Sky, and YouTube. So without further ado, Dr. Swain, please take it away.
Well, thank you for that introduction. It's always great to be speaking to an audience not too far from where I grew up in the North Bay in San Rafael. And I'll be trying to be mindful of the fact that this conversation is being interpreted, so I'll purposefully leave a little bit of a gap between some of the slides I'm about to present today. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. You'll briefly see a few things pop up, and then you should see my slides full screen momentarily. That should be the case now.
Looking good.
All right, so what I wanted to speak about this evening was, in general, climate change in California, but going a little bit beyond the basics and thinking about the different ways where there are both certainties and uncertainties regarding how climate change is likely to manifest in this particular part of the world. And I will have a few call outs to Sonoma County in particular in this presentation, but mostly I'm sort of talking about California on the whole, including some differences between what a lot of folks might expect the future to hold and what I think it might actually hold. Those are, I have come to learn that there's often a little bit of a gap there. We'll get into that this evening, and I look forward to having some time for Q&A at the end. So just a very quick overview of where we are globally, since I think that's always an important piece of context before we zoom in. Uh, the Earth, of course, is warming, and importantly, that's causing changes in the Earth's climate beyond temperature. So we often think about global warming, for reasons that make a lot of sense, as an increase in the Earth's overall average temperature. But there are many other things that change in response to that increase in temperature, partly because the warming is not uniform in space or time. So there are some seasons warming faster than other seasons. There are many regions, like the Arctic, and the continents generally, which are warming faster than the rest of the world. Um, and there are other aspects of the climate system that shift in response to the knock-on effects of that warming as well. So much of what I'll be talking about tonight goes beyond temperature, and talks about these other changes that we'll be seeing both in California and beyond. We do know at this point it's crystal clear that the essentially the sole reason why the Earth is warming as rapidly as it is at present is the human-caused emission of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which have accumulated beyond where they would be without those human activities, and that is exerting a net warming effect that affects the whole planet. And those human activities, of course, include fossil fuel burning, but another important contributor that's sometimes a bit overlooked in these conversations is land use change, how we decide to manipulate our landscapes, whether that's open spaces or cities or agriculture or open spaces and forests and grasslands and etc. All of those choices uh, are influencing the rate of the warming we're seeing and the amount of total greenhouse gas emission that has occurred historically. So there are, of course, those tailpipe emissions, those factory smokestacks that we would imagine are contributing to global warming, and indeed are. But there's also some other things that we don't think about as much, and they have been really important contributors in recent decades in particular. We're at a point right now where the Earth has warmed about 1.3 to 1.4 degrees centigrade, or about 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit, if you use a multi-year moving average window. Now, if you've heard the news over the past couple of years, you might have heard that the Earth's average temperature has now risen above 1.5 degrees centigrade, both last year and this year, and that is indeed true. So we have recently, at least for a year or so, eclipsed that 1.5 degree level of warming that is so prominently discussed, for example, in the Paris Agreement that we've heard a lot about. It's not quite an apples to apples comparison because the multi-year average temperature is what's referred to when we hear about the 1.5 or the 2 degree or the 3 degree temperature targets set forth in the Paris Accords or other international climate agreements, reports like the IPCC report, for example. Those numbers are being measured on a multi-year basis, so we're not quite there yet at 1.5, but we're getting really close, and that rate of warming recently has picked up the pace. So we saw a period around the year between the year 2000 and 2010 where global warming was a bit slower than it had been in previous decades, but now we've just experienced a decade where global warming has once again sped up quite considerably. And so this is one of the concerns that it's going to be quite difficult, if not impossible, to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade or even 2 degrees centigrade. So we are still on a path then toward quite a bit of additional global warming. So potentially on our current trajectory, and recent geopolitical events don't necessarily paint a rosier picture in this respect. We're still on a path to essentially double the amount of global warming that we've seen so far. So on a path toward 2.5 to 3 degrees centigrade, or about 4.5 to 5.5 degrees Fahrenheit of global average warming by later this century. And just to be really clear, the societal and ecological impacts of doubling the warming we've already seen will be much greater than a doubling of those impacts because each increment of a degree of warming, as I'll talk about in the rest of the presentation, has a greater effect than the last. Okay, so to zoom in on California now, it is, of course, a warmer place than it used to be. And if we look at Sonoma County in particular, which is the chart that I just pulled up a couple days ago, so this is fully up to date, uh, all the way through January of this year, it's clearly a warmer place than it was even 50 or 60 years ago. In fact, the last 10 or 15 years in particular have really seen a stair step upward. We've really seen an elevated plateau in temperatures since about the year 2012 or so in California generally, and also specifically in the North Bay and Sonoma County. Most of the years we've seen in the past decade would have been as warm or even warmer than the previously warmest years on record for the entire 20th century. And we have seen that the warming we've observed in California is generally faster across inland areas and at higher elevations than it is along the coast. And I'll have another chart that sort of illustrates what that looks like in the Bay Area in just a moment. So as you'd expect, we are seeing longer and more intense heat waves. And indeed, there has been, again, a particularly large increase in recent years where all three of California's hottest summers on record have occurred in the past 10 years. Obviously, if we had a stationary or unchanging climate, that would be extraordinarily unlikely. So this is just an indication, really, of that rapid pace of change. But as I mentioned, there is slightly slower warming along the coast. So I wanted to dive in a little bit more to that because that coastal fog and that coastal reprieve from inland heat waves is such a characteristic piece of Bay Area climate. Historically, I often get a lot of questions about whether that's likely to continue amid large-scale warming. So, as promised, here's another comparison on the left here between how much it's warmed in summer, so June through August on a statewide basis, and then here is how much San Francisco County below has warmed over the same period at the same time of year. And of course, San Francisco is one of the cooler spots in California in summer, all of that coastal fog. But the other thing that you might notice is that the rate of warming is essentially 4 times slower in summer in San Francisco County than it has been in recent decades on a statewide basis. So it is still warming. San Francisco and the coast are, of course, still getting warmer, but they're getting warmer at a slower pace, and inland regions are warming quite rapidly. Uh, and we see this primarily in regions that are strongly affected by that coastal marine layer, that layer of fog and low stratus clouds, and occasionally, if you're lucky or unlucky, depending on your perspective, I suppose if you're a redwood tree, this is a fortuitous climatological reality, drizzle in the summer months. And what that means is that we're still seeing that coastal fog in a lot of regions is still making a strong showing, at least in most years. There have been some years where it has been conspicuously absent compared to typical conditions, but in general, it's still foggy in May and June in a lot of the places where it's long been foggy along the coast in May and June. So this brings me to the future of coastal fog. What is going to happen to that famous or infamous California marine layer? And the answer is surprisingly, and despite and somewhat to the contrary, that I've seen in some headlines recently, we still don't really know. This is actually one of the larger uncertainties, not necessarily one of the more consequential ones, but actually one of the ones that people ask me most often about. And I'll tell you why I think this is an interesting scientific question as well as a practical one. The reason is that there are essentially two competing effects. One is that the presence of this marine layer is driven by several different factors. One, we have the California cold current between the Golden Gate and the Farallon Islands offshore that brings really cold water vertically upward from the depths of the ocean. There is this vertical overturning ocean current that keeps an almost functionally infinite cold water supply at great depth in the ocean rising toward the surface due to wind patterns near the coast. And so long as that continues, and there's every indication that it generally has and probably will, what we see is that there's still a lot of cold water, very chilly ocean water off the coast of San Francisco, even as California warms rapidly. So that source of cold, clammy air that causes tourists in San Francisco on the Golden Gate Bridge to run for the souvenir shops where they can buy the sweatshirt in May and June, that's likely to continue even with global warming. Uh, One of the reasons is that the sea breeze circulation, so essentially the winds that blow from the ocean to inland areas every afternoon, or most afternoons during fog season. If you've ever been on Highway 101 as the fog rolls in over the Golden Gate Bridge, or the Marin Headlands, or 280 on the San Francisco Peninsula as it comes in over the Santa Cruz Mountains, or even if you're in the Central Valley, and occasionally the fog will creep over the Coast Range Mountains or through the Carquinez Strait. All of that comes on the heels of these onshore breezes, the sea breeze, the breeze that blows from the ocean to land areas in summer. One of the main reasons why those onshore winds blow is because of what's known as the thermal circulation. So essentially, it gets very hot in the Sacramento Valley, inland areas, and the inland East Bay valleys in the Bay Area. It's not uncommon for Sacramento, of course, to reach 95 or 100 degrees in the peak of summer, at the same time that San Francisco might be stuck in the low to mid 50s under a damp fog layer. That temperature contrast between the cold, damp air along the coast and the dry, warm air inland causes that wind to blow. And it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy that the stronger the contrast between the cool coast and the warm inland area, the stronger that sea breeze is drawn inland. So, in a warming climate, as the Central Valley has warmed faster than the coast, that sea breeze tendency actually gets a bit stronger. So, there's an even stronger contrast between the already cool coast and the already hot inland areas that causes an increased propensity for that sea breeze to draw even more of that cool air inland, keeping that coast foggy. We've seen that dynamic play out pretty dramatically in recent years, where places like Sacramento and inland parts of California have experienced their hottest summer on record, and the immediate coast has been relatively close to the 20th century average summer temperatures. We've seen that play out both in Northern California near San Francisco Bay Area and also in Southern California in recent years. In fact, that happened just this past summer, which was the single hottest summer on record on a statewide basis, but was not a particularly remarkable summer in places like San Francisco or the west side of LA. We do see, of course, the atmosphere is drying, though, on average in a warming climate, and we see that stronger marine inversion, so that temperature condition where temperatures increase vertically with height. That keeps a nice stable lid on the atmosphere and keeps that cold, moist air in the fog layer trapped near the surface. That, too, increases in a warming climate. So we're sort of left with this tug of war ultimately between the inland areas warming faster than the coast and generating a stronger sea breeze, but also the fact that the air itself is drying. And so these have opposing effects. Which will win the tug of war? Honestly, we don't know at this point, and this is what the primary reason why we are not quite certain what might happen with coastal fog in a warming world. By the way, I just threw this plot for Sonoma County in to replace the San Francisco one. And as you can see, Sonoma is warming in summer at a rate somewhere between the cool San Francisco County coast and the statewide average. Now, of course, even Sonoma County probably has a bit of a gradient. I don't have the data to share tonight, but I suspect that places like Santa Rosa are probably warming much faster than places right along the Pacific coast. So to shift gears a bit, I really want to focus on precipitation and hydroclimate, primarily in this conversation tonight. And I'll zoom back out again briefly to give a broader global perspective before honing in again on California specifically. In a warming world, the global average precipitation increases incrementally, pretty slowly at a rate of around 2% per degree centigrade of global mean warming. But extreme precipitation increases at a far faster rate, several times, in fact, faster than average precipitation. But what I really want to point out is this, and this is not intended to be a data intensive slide. So I mostly just want folks to squint a little bit at these maps. If you look at the map on the left, that's a depiction of the projected change in average precipitation over the surface of the Earth for each degree of warming. And the map on the right is the same thing, but for extreme precipitation as opposed to average precipitation. The main thing I want to illustrate here is that the mean precipitation change map is a bit of a patchwork of increases and decreases. There's some regions where there's shaded in brown, denoting decreases, other regions shaded in green, and there's other regions where there's really very little change at all, sort of weak colors on either direction. But if you look at the map on the right, you see there's a whole lot more green or blue on that map, signifying that there's far more confidence that increases in the most extreme downpours will be larger and more widespread than will be changes in average precipitation. And this is broadly true on a global basis, as well as being true in California. If you zoom in on these maps, you in fact see that we don't even necessarily know or have high confidence regarding how the average precipitation in California may change in a warming climate. That's would be what we call sign change uncertainty, in the sense that it could be a slight increase, it could be a slight decrease, or it might not change a whole lot at all. And yet those very same projections using those very same climate models strongly suggest a large increase in the most extreme downpours, even in this place where they don't agree on the sign, increase or decrease, of precipitation change. Hold that thought for a bit as I continue. So there's also the change in the character of evaporation as well as precipitation that I think bears a stronger mention, I think, a stronger billing perhaps than it's gotten historically. And that's because evaporation and precipitation are two sides of the same hydrologic coin. The landscapes that we all care about ultimately experience the net balance between precipitation and evaporation. So plants don't necessarily know how much it rained, but they know how much water is left once it's rained and once evaporation has come along and done its thing subsequently. So in other words, plants know how much moisture is in the soil, and that is a product not only of precipitation, the supply, but also evaporation, the demand back by the atmosphere, what's left in the end. And although there has been a bit of a relative humidity decrease over land so far, and that is likely to continue, overall we tend not to see large changes in relative humidity even as temperatures rise. But interestingly, even if we assume that relative humidity stays completely constant with warming, which might be a little bit of a stretch, but let's make that assumption just for a sake of scientific argument for a moment. Even in that hypothetical reality, where relative humidity stays exactly the same as it has been historically, the thirstiness of the atmosphere, in other words, its evaporative demand, its propensity to demand or to evaporate water from the landscape, rises exponentially with that warming. This has pretty major implications for a variety of practical purposes. So for the purposes of this conversation, it might be helpful to think of this process using an analogy that my colleagues and I recently termed the expanding atmospheric sponge effect. So imagine that the air in a warming climate is akin to a rapidly expanding kitchen sponge. It's exactly the same sponge. It has no special or magical properties. It just gets larger as temperatures rise. And it gets larger by about 7% per degree centigrade or about 4% per degree Fahrenheit of warming. Now, what this means in practice is that the larger sponge has a greater capacity to absorb water. So if you spill a bunch of water on your kitchen counter and you use the larger sponge to soak it up, you wring it out over the sink, and that larger sponge is capable of yielding more water over the sink. But even if you haven't spilled that water, and this is the key part, that larger sponge still has greater absorptive capacity. So even if there's no water to absorb, it retains the ability to absorb more water than the small one. This is exactly what happens in the real world atmosphere. If it's saturated in a warmer climate, it has a greater capacity to generate increasingly extreme downpours because there is literally more water in the air that can potentially fall out as precipitation. But if that air is not saturated, and conditions are not favorable for precipitation, it actually is going to induce more rapid or more intense evaporation or evaporative demand. And so thereby acting like the progressively larger sponge, both when it's saturated and producing more extreme precipitation in this analogy, but also when it's not, which in this analogy means stronger and faster evaporation. So in other words, in a warming climate, the atmosphere becomes both thirstier when it's not raining, but also capable of much more intense downpours when it is. And all of this leads to a term that we recently called hydroclimate whiplash, which is really just a fancy way of saying an unusually rapid swing between wet and dry conditions. And we're not comparing the Sahara Desert to the Amazon rainforest here. We're making this comparison relative to a given location's typical climate. So we're comparing apples to apples. When we look at the existing scientific evidence, and in this case, we reviewed 200 existing scientific papers, as well as conducting a little bit of a new analysis on our own. And this is something we published just last month. We find nearly universal projected global increases in these rapid transitions between extremely wet and extremely dry conditions that we called hydroclimate whiplash. These increases are likely to emerge sooner, stronger, and faster over land versus ocean. And this increase is likely to accelerate when global warming reaches a level somewhere between about 1 and 3 degrees centigrade. Now, again, remember where I mentioned we were earlier in this presentation. On a multi-year basis, we're at about 1.4 degrees centigrade of warming, but in the past couple of years have been 1.5 degrees or above. So the point being, we're right in the middle of this range where we expect hydroclimate whiplash to accelerate considerably, and there is some evidence that we're already seeing that unfold today. So to bring it back to California, a little brief primer on the climate in this part of the world. Those of you, of course, who live in Northern California, as I suspect many of you do, are quite familiar with this, but it's still worth characterizing, I think, or reminding folks just how unusual the climate of California is in a North American and global context. California exists at the margin of the stable subtropical climate regime to its south and the more active mid-latitude climate regime to its north. And this means that there is not only a strong seasonal cycle of precipitation, as illustrated in this animation on the left here, characterized by a pronounced wet season in winter and a pronounced dry season in summer, but also a strong latitudinal gradient. So in other words, Northern California is generally much wetter than Southern California. It also means that this part of the world is susceptible to very high year-to-year variation in precipitation. In fact, uniquely so in a North American context, or at least in a continental United States context, as is illustrated on the map on the right. This also means that the region is particularly susceptible to drought because realistically, there's only a few months in any given year when the vast majority of the precipitation would fall. So essentially, if we have a really dry winter, there's very little chance of making that up until the following winter because we know, generally speaking, we aren't going to get a whole lot of rain between spring and fall. Okay, so what's going on in California? What changes have we seen so far beyond the temperature changes that I already mentioned? Well, we haven't really seen a large change in precipitation on average over the past century, believe it or not. And this is always a bit of a surprise, I think, to a lot of folks when I show them this chart. Again, I updated this all the way through December of 2024, so just 2 months ago. There is a slight decrease over the past few decades, but it's really very small compared to the variability over the 20th century. But what's not so small and what's not so constant is the moisture variability that we're seeing. So talking about whiplash, this is a different definition, but generally speaking, we see that the hydroclimate variability, these swings between wet and dry conditions since the early 1980s, are considerably elevated to what they were earlier in the 20th century. And it's a noisy trend to be sure, but we've seen multiple episodes since the year 1990 or 2000 or so where this variability has been at extremely high levels relative to what we would have seen during most of the 20th century. And in addition to that increase in moisture variability, we also have a strong trend towards more frequent and more severe drought events. So you might ask, okay, if there's very little trend in the mean precipitation, but there's an increase in the variability of moisture in California and also a strong trend towards worse droughts, how can the math possibly pencil out here? I'll leave that as a cliffhanger for now. I'll get to the answer in just a couple slides. But first, I just want to, and I created this slide. I've actually been creating this slide as I go through California, different parts of the state, realizing that there are so many places in California that are poster childs for hydroclimate whiplash over the past decade that it's actually possible to create this slide nearly for every California county, although I would argue that Sonoma County has been hit particularly hard. All of this, by the way, is from the past decade, so I'm only focusing on the last 10 years. We start with what was then essentially a historically severe drought in 2013 and 2014 that lingered for a couple of years thereafter. The worst drought at the time since the 76-77 drought, and in some ways worse because this was a much warmer drought with similarly low precipitation. Then, of course, the catastrophic wildfires that occurred in autumn of 2017 throughout the North Bay and beyond, most notably the Tubbs Fire. It was not that long thereafter, less than 2 years later, when some of the worst floods in Sonoma County, on the Russian River in particular, occurred that we've seen in quite some time. But then right back to very destructive wildfires in 2020 with the LNU complex and in Sonoma County specifically the Wallbridge fire being the most destructive one locally, although far more structures were burned in Napa and Solano counties and other North Bay fires as well as others around the state. 2021 and 2022 brought yet another historically severe drought that was essentially just as bad as the historic drought that occurred less than a decade earlier in 2013 through 2015. But now, and I actually skipped some steps. There were additional flood events between 2021 and 2024, but I'm just choosing the most recent one. Again, in Sonoma County, as recently as November, just a few months ago, when essentially the strongest atmospheric river on record, certainly the most intense combination of persistence and strength occurred, bringing record-breaking rainfall and the single wettest 2, 3, 4 day period on record in places like Santa Rosa. Again, this is just a couple months back. In the very same year, by the way, that Southern California saw a very different problem. So, as I mentioned, Southern California has seen very different conditions than Northern California this year, and an entirely different type of whiplash unfolded in recent months, culminating in a pretty devastating, historically devastating wildfire event. But it's important to remember the full sequence of events because in 2023 and 2024, Southern California was extremely wet. In fact, some places saw their wettest 18-month period on record. That led to abundant growth of herbaceous vegetation, grass and brush in what are in many places grass and brush dominated ecosystems in Southern California. But that was then followed by, across inland and desert and mountain regions this past summer, record heat and evaporative demand, as well as then an essential failure of the start of the rainy season in 2024-2025. And the challenge is following that record dry start to the rainy season up through mid-January in Southern California, we then had a very strong, dry, arguably violent wind event that brought wind gusts to 80 or even 90 miles an hour in populated parts of the LA basin. And that 1-2 punch, that sequence of very wet to very dry, what we might call wet to dry hydroclimate whiplash, leading to first abundant vegetation accumulation and then extreme vegetation desiccation, followed by those strong winds, set the stage for the devastating fires that followed just about a month and a half ago. So all of this plays into expectations about how our future might look. I often get the question, does California look wetter or drier in the future? And it's almost a trick question at this point. The answer is both. As I suggested, we don't really know what's going to happen with California's average precipitation, and yet we're quite sure that the driest dries will be drier and the wettest wets wetter still. That leads to a substantial increase, which gets larger the farther south in California you go, in what we termed at the time, this was back in 2018, hydro or precipitation whiplash, a slightly narrower version of the hydroclimate whiplash that I've been talking about otherwise. We also may even see an increase in what I might call seasonal whiplash. So we already have a rather strong seasonality of precipitation in California. So dry autumn, dry spring, and wet winter. But most indications are that our winter will stay quite wet, maybe even get a bit wetter, in fact, especially in Northern California on average. But the shoulder seasons, if you will, the autumn and the spring, may become even drier, leading to an even greater accentuation between the intensity of a slightly wetter wet season and a substantially drier dry season. That has some pretty significant practical implications. On the autumn end, in particular, it has major implications for wildfire risk, as we saw this past year, but it also has major implications for natural ecosystems as well as irrigated uh, agriculture and even people's gardens and city parks, because it means there's a longer water deficit season that plants have to cope with. And there is an indication that Northern California might see a slight increase in winter precipitation while Southern California sees a slight decrease, although these changes are still expected to be small relative to the whiplash changes that are more prominent. But statewide, we expect to see an increase not only in year-to-year precipitation, not only in hydroclimate whiplash, not only in seasonal whiplash, but even within seasons, even within the winter months themselves, an increased number of swings between very dry months individually, followed by very wet ones, even within the same rainy season. And I think we've seen that quite a bit recently, even as we speak this year. Again, recognizing that November was one of the wettest months on record in some parts of Northern California, and we've been seen 30 or 40-day periods this winter which have been nearly bone dry in some very same parts of the state. So on the wet side of things, we expect that the main mechanism for the wetter wets in this part of the world is an intensification of a familiar friend or foe, depending on the context, atmospheric river storms. Atmospheric rivers are these filamentary or ribbon-like corridors of concentrated atmospheric water vapor transport. So in other words, moist air moving quickly, blown by the wind above your head. And as that atmospheric sponge expands, we eventually expect to see an increase in the intensity of the most intense events and eventually the emergence of historically unprecedented atmospheric river events. And I might skip through a few of these slides in the interest of time, but suffice it to say that there is a long history of great floods in California and that a modern day repeat would be pretty disastrous. And this was motivation for us embarking on a contingency planning scenario, if you will. So sort of an extreme flood scenario, a hypothetical extreme flood scenario for the state of California aimed at better understanding risks and vulnerabilities and potential interventions. This was an extension of an earlier project called ArcStorm, and so we called it ArcStorm 2.0. But the basic idea is this. One of the worst plausible flood scenarios for California is a 3 to 4 week long sequence of moderate to strong, low, occasionally extreme strength atmospheric rivers. What we found is that it would be plausible for such a sequence to drop over 50 inches of rain in just 30 days. In fact, in some of the higher elevation locations in the Sierra Nevada, that total might end up closer to 80 to 100 inches. Again, we're not talking about snow here. We're talking about liquid water equivalent, 80 to 100 inches locally in the mountains. And even in places like the Bay Area, we're talking about some of the North Bay Hills, Santa Cruz Mountains, places the typical wet spots in the Bay Area, we're still talking about 40 to locally even 60 inches of rain potentially in just 30 days. As a matter of perspective, we have two arc storm scenarios. We have a lesser arc storm scenario occurring hypothetically in a cooler 20th century climate, and another hypothetical scenario occurring called arc future in a warmer 21st century climate. What we found is that the 2022-2023 winter, the very wettest 30-day period from that winter, if you recall, that caused significant flooding in Sonoma County and throughout much of California, we got about 80% of the way to the lesser historical event. So a decent chunk of the way there, although we would still have needed to have added an additional 20% of precipitation during the very wettest 30-day period from 2022-2023 winter to get to that point. But relative to our plausible worst case scenario in arc future in a warmer climate, the very wettest 30-day period in what was essentially the wettest winter we've seen in decades only got halfway there to the kind of territory we're talking about in this plausible worst case future scenario. So in other words, flood risk in a warming climate in California looms large. And just because we haven't seen a very large increase in the number or the severity of floods in California recently does not mean that we shouldn't be anticipating these risks to emerge perhaps rather suddenly at some point later in the coming decades. So we know that droughts, of course, have gotten worse. I've already talked about that. And this is a bit of a repeat from earlier, so I won't belabor the point too much. But essentially, what we know is that the same amount of water doesn't go as far as it used to. And this is not a statement about human water use. This is a purely physical statement about how the same amount of water falling from the sky doesn't last as long because a lot more of it is evaporating right back into the air than used to be the case. You can blame the expanding atmospheric sponge for that one. This, of course, is all related to wildfire risk as well. And I know Sonoma County has been one of the particularly hard-hit counties in all of California in terms of wildfire over the past decade or so. And there is extensive evidence that the relationship between vegetation dryness, here referred to as fuel aridity, can be exponential, at least in forested ecosystems. And there are many places that have already experienced a dramatic shift upward in the driest dries when it comes to vegetation moisture. So not necessarily getting drier all the time. Think back to the last couple of winters, or even right now, where it's very wet in a place like Sonoma County compared to our drought years. But in the very driest dries, the worst droughts, the most evaporatively demanding episodes where that expanding atmospheric sponge is exerting its influence most dramatically, we see a large increase in the area burned and the intensity of the fires that occur under those settings. And so we see that there's really quite abundant evidence at this point that climate change is making wildfires more intense and more dangerous. And what we found is that there's already been about a doubling in the frequency of the most extreme fire weather conditions in autumn throughout California. This was between the early 1980s and about 2018. That's a pretty large increase in the frequency of the kind of events that we've come to understand are quite dangerous and can be very disruptive when these, or even deadly, when these extreme fire conditions coincide with ignitions in the wrong place and the wrong time. And this is a term I borrowed back when Jerry Brown was governor, but the notion of a new abnormal, sort of contrasting from a new normal. And I think that thinking about this as a new abnormal is probably a better way to think about it, because the warming is not static. We're continuing to see additional warming, additional changes in California's climate that will continue to evolve. So we shouldn't get too used to or too comfortable with what we're seeing today, because the new norm is continued change and continued warming and continued shifts in risk of events like wildfire. So what I really think this tells us is that we need to get quite serious about risk-reducing interventions in the face of increasing climate-driven wildfire risk. In other words, even though climate change is a big part of the reason why the risk of wildfire has been increasing in California, some of the most important risk-reducing interventions in the short term actually don't have to do with climate. So while they might ironically be motivated by the climate-driven increases in risk, the most important interventions might actually be at a state, local, or even individual property level in terms of reducing our risk by improving fire resiliency of structures and of landscapes. And we can talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A session if folks are interested. And this is a slide that unfortunately I've updated every few years with yet a new escalatory wildfire catastrophe. But it's not to make folks uncomfortable about the level of wildfire disaster that we've seen, since I know there are probably quite a few folks who have joined this evening who have personally experienced this or even potentially lost their homes or worse in one of these fires. But my point really that I want to emphasize is this. The wildfire itself is not inherently a bad thing. It is a natural part of most ecosystems in the Western US, even a necessary part of many of them. But the real problem is its intersection with populated areas, and that has led to increasing disasters. And if we don't change our path, I don't think we've seen the worst wildfire disasters that we'll experience yet in the 21st century. And I think that is probably evidenced by the fact that every time I've created a new version of this slide over the past 10 years, there's generally been a new event that has eclipsed a previous one in some respects. So I think the important question when it comes to wildfire and climate change, both in California and elsewhere, is not so much if we can decouple wildfire with catastrophic risk. I think we definitely can do it. I think the real question is, will we? And that's a bit of a different type of question because it's both a good news and a bad news situation in the sense that we know what we need to be doing to greatly reduce the risks. And we're starting to do many of those things, but we haven't yet implemented a lot of these interventions at the scale that we would need to keep pace, let alone offset the climate-caused increase in risk that we're seeing over time. All right, so I want to sum it up and try and leave plenty of time for some questions now. Let the animation play here. But the physical reality is that we're seeing an increase, not only in precipitation intensity in projections for California's future hydroclimate, but also in overall aridity. These are not mutually exclusive things. Of course, they can't happen at the same time, but they can happen in the same place at different times. And that is exactly, I think, what we've seen some dramatic examples over the past decade, both in Sonoma County and elsewhere. I didn't talk about it so much in this presentation because there's not a great deal of snowpack either historically or at present in Sonoma County, but this does become really important in the mountain areas, especially where, given that much of California's water supply, again, not so much of Sonoma's, but elsewhere in the state, that snowpack is critically important, and we will be losing a considerable portion of it in a warming climate, as well as seeing more extreme heat and runoff. As I mentioned, a key theme here is ever greater variability and increased hydroclimate whiplash, meaning the driest dries will become still drier, but also that the wettest wets wetter still. And that can be, by the way, a blessing or a curse, depending on how prepared we are for it. It is, in a sense, better news than I think some folks might have expected, that California isn't just going to become progressively drier with less and less rain. That appears to be, at this point, the least likely outcome. And indeed, so far, California has not seen less precipitation on average, despite seeing a dramatic increase in temperature and in drought severity. But I think in order for it to become a potential silver lining, we really need to be thinking about flexible and proactive interventions and adaptations that are commensurate with that increase in variability, thinking beyond trends in mean climate and learning to, as much as we can, embrace this increase in whiplash. So what does that mean specifically? Well, from a wildfire perspective, that means embracing more fire on the landscape in one form or another. And ideally, more of it comes in the form of prescribed burning or controlled burning or indigenous and cultural burning as opposed to catastrophic wildfire. It's not a one-to-one trade-off. We can't always control it, but the more of the prescribed burning we do, there's a lot of evidence that the less catastrophic fire we'll see in places that receive those treatments. Similarly, when it comes to floodplains, letting the water do its thing in a semi-controlled way is kind of the emerging theme. Restoring floodplains, expanding floodplains, restoring watersheds, allowing more water to percolate in, encouraging water to flow more gradually over wider landscapes. All of these help reduce flood risk and also, in some cases, drought risk to the extent that the landscape can absorb more of that water during the wet periods. I think there's an important reality that we should be stress testing our existing infrastructure to a widening range of extremes. This is a bullet point I'll often give to anyone from local city emergency managers all the way up to the governor's office. But I think this is a critically important thing to understand that when we build stuff, whether that's individual structures or large-scale infrastructure, it really needs to be built to not only a different standard than we used to build it to, but a forward-looking one too. Because if we build things today or even uh, uh, adapt them or remodel them, usually those are structures that are intended to last decades, if not longer. And overall, I think a greater focus on resilience is critical. The need to address existing vulnerabilities and historical inequities in any number of settings and looking where we can to find, you could call them win-win or even win-win-win, depending on how many points you're trying to hit, interventions that are beneficial even absent climate change. So what can we do, like some of the specific things I mentioned above, that would be a good idea anyway, that would be good community and even financial investments, even if it weren't for the additional benefits or risks averted by doing so in a warming world. And so I think I've already covered a lot of these key thoughts, but I did want to emphasize this. In many ways, I think the California climate of the future will be quite familiar. It will be very recognizable, but a more extreme version, essentially, of what came before. But there will be significant societal and ecological disruptions that may come from that. A key aspect, aside from the warming itself, of course, which is faster across inland areas and not the coast, is that California will experience more hydroclimate variability, greater whiplash, and we can blame the expanding atmospheric sponge for that. More severe droughts and wildfires, unfortunately, yes, we're already living that reality, but also more severe floods, and I'm not sure that we've fully come to terms with the fact that that also is a likely part of our future. And as I mentioned, Sonoma County really has been a bit at the epicenter of a lot of this, and perhaps is a bit more aware of the sometimes overlapping risks, even in a single year, of severe floods and severe wildfires in different seasons. So the real big question in all of this is not will there be warming or will there be changes or will we need to change the way we do things? The question is how can we do this effectively and equitably by co-managing the risks of things like water scarcity, but also overabundance. The water's still going to be here, but it's going to come in increasingly large and inconvenient bursts. So again, a blessing and a curse depending on how well we prepare for that eventuality. All right, so I want to close. You can find me on the internet at all of these places, which were generously mentioned in the introduction, but I wanted to make sure we have some time for questions. So thank you again for your attention, and I'll stick around as long as the organizers are willing to stay online for this conversation.
Wonderful. Well, maybe stunned is probably the better term to use, Daniel, but as ever, you've made very knotty subjects much more comprehensible for so many of us. Before we get into the Q&A, just want to take a few minutes. We'll definitely start the Q&A in just a moment, but I want to allow folks who want to drop off to leave. But before you go, we want to ask you to stay engaged with the Land Trust and the exploration of many of these issues and how we, and we'll talk about this further, in the Land Trust community can really intervene in meaningful ways at the local, the property, the state level to address climate change. You can do that by following us on our various social media accounts or visiting our website. And do keep an eye out for this series, this Language of the Land webinars. We have one every month, and you can sign up on our website. We're a nonprofit organization, which means we rely on donations from individuals, businesses, and foundations to make our work possible. If you like what you heard today, please consider donating. Your gift helps support land protection and preservation. To make a donation online to Sonoma Land Trust, all you have to do is go to our website, sonomalandtrust.org, and click the donate button. Thank you so much, all of you. In these uncertain times, we appreciate everyone who is supporting our work. And again, also strongly encourage you to be a subscriber to the Weather West blog that Dr. Swain hosts. So, as we mentioned earlier, you can submit your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom, and we're already starting to see them come in. And so I'd like to kick off just with a couple of questions of my own. And I think, and I promise not to hog all the questions, even though I have many of them. I'd like to start off with something you said earlier, Daniel, which is how surprising it is that we can make meaningful interventions at the state, local, and even the property level, because I tend to think, in one person, in one commentator's phrase, we tend to view climate change as a hyper object. And that, I think, leads to, in some cases, at worst cases, despair and an uncertainty about to know what to do. You're saying that there's really meaningful things we can do on the ground right here, right now to make a difference at the local level.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because it is, I think, an important point of discussion given everything we see unfolding around us at the moment. I think the reality is that climate change itself is unfortunately not something that we can solve at the local level or at the state level. It is inherently a global challenge that can really only be meaningfully slowed or stopped with large-scale, coherent, frankly, pretty dramatic global action at this point. And I'm not particularly encouraged, actually, by recent global events, including, the recent direction of U.S. climate policy and the likely plausible direction in the next few years, meaning that it's quite likely, that we will see a backsliding from goals that we already weren't reaching in terms of emissions reductions or even stabilizing our emissions. So I think when some folks hear what I was talking about intervention at the local level, they're surprised because it's true that unfortunately, as much as I wish it were the case, California can't solve global warming, Sonoma County can't solve global warming on its own, as important as local actions are in that respect. But where they become transformatively important is in improving local resilience or reducing local vulnerabilities. And that is where, in fact, it almost doesn't matter what the rest of the world is doing. It's almost entirely a question of what's happening locally, regionally, and at the state level. And I think that is where the good news is. And I think wildfire is a really good example of this. I spent most of my early years growing up in the North Bay and in Marin County. And, I have in my mind's eye a picture of what a lot of the roadsides and the trail sides looked like in Marin County as recently as 10 or 15 years ago, for example. And I think this is true to a certain extent in Sonoma County as well. In the wake of some of these devastating fires we've seen around California over the past decade, there's been a concerted effort to really think about how our landscapes are managed. And what I'm realizing is that there's been for someone who's looking for it, and I always look for this whenever I'm back in the North Bay, what do the roadsides look like? Have there been prescribed fire treatments that you can see visibly on the landscape? Have there been efforts to clear some of the really dense vegetation from these flammable roadsides and from people's yards? And the answer is largely yes. you can really see the difference. It is actually quite striking. And I think that's an example of where, ironically, despite the fact that climate change has increased wildfire risk over this period, in some cases, it might be that the actual net risk at the moment is a bit lower than it was 20 years ago because through these active interventions, we've been able to more than offset that risk locally. Now, that isn't going to work everywhere all the time, but I think it's a good example of how the natural hazards, so this would be, the fire, the flood, the drought, the heat wave, whatever it is, they don't have to become disasters. They only become disasters when they affect people and the environment in negative ways due to whatever pre-existing vulnerabilities might exist in a given region. And so we live in a world where we know these physical hazards, unfortunately, are getting worse due to climate change in many cases. That is just the reality, and that's the dark side of what I was just talking about. But when it comes to the impacts, the societal effects, the disasters themselves, those are not inevitable to increase with an increase in the underlying hazard with warming if we do things actively to offset those risks. In fact, if we do a really good job, we could live in a world where the risk from a geophysical perspective of floods, of wildfires, of heat waves is greater than it ever has been in our lifetime. And yet the risk of harm to people in the communities that those events affect might actually be less than it used to be. So that's sort of a vision. It's certainly not a utopia because there will be certain things we can't adapt ourselves out of, and that is a difficult reality to face. But on the other hand, if we really do these things, we actually might be able to have quite resilient communities in a lot of cases, despite the fact that the underlying hazards themselves would still be increasing. So that's where I think a lot of the local and the regional and the state level action is super important. And we see that right now, for example. We saw that with the rebuilding in the wake of the North Bay fires with mixed results, frankly. There were some really positive stories and then some other places where there were some structures and subdivisions rebuilt exactly as they were before. And I think we're seeing this play out in Southern California again now in the wake of these fires. The rebuilding has yet to begin, but there's all sorts of conversations about how to do it differently, how to do it better. Will we do it differently? And the question right now, there's all this conversation in LA about cutting the red tape, for these disaster survivors and rebuilding. And of course, that's critically important when there's unnecessary red tape. I'm no fan of it myself. But if that red tape is fire resilient building standards, for example, I'm not so sure it's a good idea to cut that red tape if we really want to increase community level resilience. And so those are the kinds of conversations that I'm talking about there.
Thanks, Daniel. A question from Laura in our audience. Can the current evaporative demand decrease, or is it a tipping point beyond which there's no return?
Well, so the evaporative demand, think of it essentially, evaporative demand equals air thirstiness. That is increasing quite a bit, of course, because the atmosphere is behaving as that larger sponge and becoming thirstier. Uh, it is not itself a tipping point in the sense that it's not a sudden or unexpected change and that's suddenly different than it was before. It really is actually a result of fairly basic thermodynamics that have been understood since about the mid 1800s. So we actually don't need any climate models around to understand this sort of expanding atmospheric sponge process. This was understood uh, based on fairly simple experiments that are like experiments you could potentially run at home. In fact, I think a lot of people who've ever worked or owned a greenhouse are fairly familiar with this notion because the vapor pressure deficit, which is a technical term, the VPD, which a related quantity to this evaporative demand or atmospheric thirstiness, that's something that you deliberately change in a greenhouse to manipulate plant growth. It's a variable that you can sort of use to sort of turn the dial on, depending on the temperature and the amount of water you use for irrigation to achieve certain outcomes. So It's not a tipping point in and of itself. There's always some amount of evaporative demand. It's rising with warming. It is true that it's rising non-linearly. So this is that exponential curve. So each additional degree of warming does bring about a larger increase in the evaporative demand than the last. And it can bring about tipping points in ecosystems under the right settings. So for example, in places where we've seen forest die-offs, there's often a critical state beyond which a forest ecosystem can survive progressively more intense droughts up until a point, and they can return to their previous state. And once they cross a certain critical dryness point, you see that ecosystem can't come back because the trees die, and there's still some vegetation that returns, of course, but it probably won't be the same as what was there before. Perhaps you'll replace the forest with grass or brush or shrubs or something. So physically, it's not a tipping point process in itself, but it is a nonlinear process and it can lead to tipping points in ecosystems.
Kind of the vegetation succession, the ecosystem succession that we are predicting for certain chaparral ecosystems in Southern California, where again it's even more flammable, prone to wildfire than what went before, just increasing the effect. We see it again increasing exponentially.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly add on to that. There's a related notion that it was once believed, I think, for a number of years, including in some of California's early climate assessments, that wildfire risk would initially increase quite a lot, as we've seen, unfortunately, but then kind of level off with additional warming because eventually you would essentially burn so much that there wouldn't be as much left to burn. There'd be this self-limiting feedback where you burn so much vegetation and it takes a long time for it to grow back to the point where you could burn it again. That view, I think, is increasingly falling out of favor precisely for the reason you just mentioned, which is that in forests, for example, it's true that you can't regrow a forest in just a few years. That would take decades if it's going to regrow at all under changing climate conditions. But what returns instead is something else. So it doesn't remain bare soil, which of course is a good thing. You wouldn't want that. But what returns first are the grasses and the annual plants, and then the shrubs, and then the taller brush. And then if sometimes 3, 4, 5 years after a major forest fire, you now have very dense head-high brush and grass in some of these fire footprints. We're already seeing this now in some places that burned as recently as 2020 in California. So now you have a setting where you probably can't have a forest fire again for decades, but you could have a very fast spreading and high intensity brush fire within just a few years. And so what we're realizing is that this whiplash, the fact that we still see alternations between increasingly wet and increasingly dry, favors this cycle of vegetation accumulation and desiccation and burning, and then accumulation and desiccation and burning that doesn't probably have as much of a mitigating feedback as had once been believed. And this, I think, is compounded, as you say, in places like in Southern California with woody shrubs like chaparral that are being replaced following fires by invasive grasses, which themselves are sometimes even more flammable than the woody shrubs that they've replaced. And so this is a real challenge. And it speaks to the complexity of different ecosystems and different sequences of events, and also the importance of thinking about prescribed fire as a tool that is more appropriate in some ecosystems than others, vegetation thinning that is more appropriate in some settings than others, and how there really isn't like a one-size-fits-all approach that works across all of California's many diverse ecosystems.
Well, thank you for raising that point, Daniel, because often we have unnecessarily internecine fights with each other about, applying a one-size-fits-all approach to different issues. We're an agricultural county, as you know, and we're having some questions from some of our audience about what's the significance for agriculture and specifically the impacts on the soil, given how much we've already compromised our soils in California. What do we think the outcome is, or what do we think the future looks like?
Well, I'm not a soil scientist, and there very much are soil scientists out there. So I'm probably not the best person to ask about the soils question. But I think there's a few things that I would highlight. One is that fire is a great example of something that can be either restorative or destructive to the surface soil, depending on context and frequency and intensity. Grassland ecosystems, for example, most of them can burn quite frequently, sometimes even every year or two, and actually grow better following fire because of the redistribution of nutrients that follows fire. And this is true in a lot of other settings as well, where fire of sort of the right, if you will, frequency for a given ecosystem can actually really improve soil quality by getting rid of some of the denser vegetation, giving new plants room to grow, redistributing or adding new nutrients to the surface soil. But also, very high intensity fires can essentially, and unfortunately, we are seeing a large increase in the high intensity fires in particular, which is a problem. Those can, in certain circumstances, essentially cook the soil, sterilizing it. Essentially, the soil has mycology and microbiology. This really diverse microbial ecosystems can really become disrupted by these high intensity fires, since they will literally pasteurize the surface. That has also hydrologic implications because you can get what's known as a hydrophobic soil layer following fires, which causes water to sort of bead off and run off. I've demonstrated this a few times to folks, but if you go into a wildfire burn footprint soon after the fire, you can dump a water bottle onto the soil and it will just sort of roll off as if it's a waterproof jacket. It's actually a little bit eerie to see it. That eventually goes away, of course, but it can take time. There's also the question of, what is going on with carbon in soils, and that's even farther afield from what I'm actually an expert in. But again, here there are sort of mixed things going on. So, when we have a high intensity forest fire that kills off giant sequoias, as we've seen, there's a tremendous amount of below surface root system carbon stored in some of these forests. And if those trees don't make it, that is carbon that is going to re-enter the atmosphere. But also, we know that in some situations, fire can actually cause more carbon to be sequestered by plants and therefore in the soil in the aftermath. So it gets complicated. There's also different levels of carbon being sequestered by plants generally, because as the air has more CO2 carbon in it, there's all sorts of big open questions in the plant, sort of the biometeorology world that is a field of study. What are plants going to do? And the answer is, at first glance, oh, there's more carbon. They'll grow more readily. They'll put on more biomass. But it turns out it's not that simple, because not all plants respond the same way. In fact, in periods of water scarcity, which we're seeing, as I mentioned, more of, those very same plants that might otherwise have more biomass, store more carbon, put more carbon underground in their root systems, might actually end up not absorbing or not having as much biomass because they're not able to do so successfully as a result of those water limitations. And so there's really complex behavior at play. I think it's hard to generalize, but there's all sorts of considerations, from the ambient increase in atmospheric CO2 to the short and long-term effect of fire and different ecosystems and high versus low intensity fire as well. What's happening with the hydrology, with the deposition of sediments and nutrients as we see flood and drought cycles. All of these things end up being really important, and your mileage may vary locally. Probably best to ask a soil scientist about the details.
Going back to the whole question of precipitation and water management, and knowing that California is the most hydrologically altered place on planet Earth. One of the things I've heard you say is that we will not engineer our way out of this problem. Can you kind of explore a little bit that whole idea of what we can and can't do with respect to natural systems of water retention and water storage?
Yeah, there's a Jurassic Park quote that I think is relevant to most of these conversations, um, and it's that life finds a way. The same thing is true of water and of fire, and I guess I have Jeff Goldblum to thank for that one. But I think the reality is that I would never argue that it's not a good idea to have flood protection infrastructure in place or fire protection infrastructure in place. I think it's a very good public service that California has the most advanced wildland firefighting agency in the world with a veritable army of personnel and equipment and aircraft, unlike anywhere else on Earth. I think sometimes folk get a little confused when we say you can't fight everything. It doesn't mean you should never fight anything. But it means that in the extremes, there is sometimes you can't, there's a limit to what you can achieve with active and direct intervention and technology. And this is actually, I think, a big part of why there's been so much, uh, like we can call it lively discussion about why the LA fires were as bad as they were, how they became so bad so quickly. And I think it is just a mismatch of a lot of folks' sense of scale. Those events were just so extreme from a geophysical perspective in the very highest risk areas under the very most extreme conditions that even essentially the most comprehensive, multi-layered firefighting capacity in the world in the city, county of LA, and then CAL FIRE, and then all these other agencies still were not able to prevent these catastrophes from unfolding, despite the fact that they knew in advance that these high risk conditions were occurring. I don't even see that necessarily, despite the ongoing political discussion, I don't even really see this as a failure of firefighting or of plannings. I see it as an indication of the limits on what firefighting can achieve under the most extreme circumstances in a setting where we had neighborhoods that were not designed for fire. We did not adequately acknowledge that there will be some conditions under which we cannot manage the risks. The same thing is true of flood risk. I am thrilled that Sacramento has not had serious flooding since the major flood control infrastructure went in there decades ago. The YOLO bypass is actually a pretty good example of a win-win solution, which is this: if you ever drive between Davis and Sacramento and you're on the causeway on Interstate 80, the reason why it's a causeway is that entire region, it's almost 20 miles wide in spots, is designed now to flood when we need it to flood. You don't see subdivisions there. There is some farming, but it's farming where you can afford to just let it flood for months at a time if need be. That's a pretty good example of the kinds of, it still required engineering. They still had to build the weir system. They still had to design the levee system. They still had to build the causeway. So it's not like, it's anti, um, anti-engineering or anti-pouring the concrete. But what it tells us is it's acknowledging that sometimes it's better to let the water do its thing. Let the yellow bypass fill. Let's save Sacramento. Also, it's fine to plant some rice there because what's the harm of a few feet of water in a rice paddy? Also, by the way, it's a nice reprieve along the Pacific Flyway for migratory birds when it's full of water. So this is an example of a solution that actually turned out to be a really good idea. It's worked well. But we need to be doing those things at even greater scale in more places, and sometimes on smaller scales too. Sometimes you don't have 10 to 15 miles of land that you can work with in this setting, but you might be able to do it at individual property or parcel scale or projects within individual communities. So I think there are some places where we do need to probably bolster our defenses. If there are critical flood protection levees that are, in these, people live where they do. Unfortunately, some of these recent developments in California are in very high fire and flood risk zones. I don't think it's reasonable to say, oh, we just need to let those flood, let those people have their houses underwater, let them burn. I think we need to do what we can to prevent that from happening, given people live where they do. And so that does mean building stronger, maybe taller levees in some places for flood risk, or thinking about how to bolster, emergency firefighting response in other places. But it's also a question of saying, okay, but if we're going to do that, we also probably need to have more levee setbacks, more floodplain restoration. We need to have more prescribed fire. We need to have more acknowledgement that not all of the fires we see are necessarily catastrophes. And so all of this kind of goes hand in hand. There are some things we're going to need to build. In fact, there will be things we need to build in some cases to let the water do its thing in the way that we want, or to allow some of these fires to pass through certain areas without causing the harm that they've caused historically. So that does require active intervention. It's not just stepping back and doing nothing, but it's thinking differently about the kinds of interventions that we use and being mindful and actively intervening in a way that allows us to not always fight everything 100%, but sort of work with the flames or work with the water, as the case may be.
I think that's a great segue to a question I want to make sure we ask before a lot of our folks might drop off at 7:30, and we'll keep going a little longer than that because there's so many questions built up here. But I wanted to pivot very quickly to your role as a climate change communicator. And I guess I have a multi-part question, but essentially the first question is, what advice or what ways do you recommend people talk about climate change in their communities, around the water cooler, around the breakfast table, to elevate this conversation in a rational, almost normal manner where we can have actual conversations about climate change without retreating to either despair or unrealistic hope, and certainly not getting lost into sort of deep political discussions about whether or not climate change is actually happening. How do you kind of normalize that conversation? And what would be your advice?
I mean, I think the first step is to have those conversations in the first place. I think one of the things that's always amazing to me is that when they do public opinions polling of Americans, most people say they almost never hear about climate change in their day-to-day life. Almost never. And of course, I'm a climate scientist who's, was also a weather geek. I have probably the most biased possible personal life experience in this respect. So I shouldn't be as surprised as I am. But it always strikes me as one of the most surprising uh, pieces of evidence that we don't talk about it enough because we haven't normalized it. And the funny thing is, like the prototypical small talk that you might engage with, with a cashier or someone at the coffee shop or something, somebody you don't, a stranger, in a taxi cab or something. Like, you talk about the weather. It's long been like essentially synonymous with small talk with people you don't necessarily a societally acceptable topic of conversation no matter who you're engaging with, a neutral topic. And the great irony is that climate is like the opposite of that, even though what is climate but weather in aggregate? So we're only allowed to talk about, it's only polite to talk about the short-term variations in the atmosphere as opposed to the long-term, apparently. But I think that's kind of silly, just like I think that the artificial separation of weather and climate in the academic world, which to a certain extent still persists today, is this kind of nonsensical. So I think the first step is to normalize it, actually, and to just have those conversations with people in your day-to-day life as if it were talking about the weather. And I think an important part is to be reasonably informed about how things are changing where you live so that you can be reasonably accurate in those conversations. But I actually think the weather is a good point of entry for that. Is it unusually hot in your area at a given moment in time? That's a pretty good opportunity to talk about how it's warmer than it used to be and how it's continuing to get warmer. Is it unusually dry or wet? Well, in a place like California, both of those, I think, are fair game. Do you smell wildfire smoke, or is it actually from a prescribed burn? Those are both really interesting entry points for a conversation that goes beyond just, oh, isn't it terrible? But okay, why is it the way it is? And actually, is it terrible? Because it does depend somewhat on the context of what you're experiencing. And so I actually think the most effective thing is simply to normalize it. Just start talking about it because most people don't experience those conversations. They don't engage with those conversations at all in their day-to-day life. So talking about it with your friends and family, and yes, with with strangers on the street if you're going to strike up a conversation in the coffee shop. I do that. And I don't even necessarily otherwise talk to folks on the street all that much. But I will engage people who I meet in my day-to-day life on those sorts of topics. And often it leads interesting places. You really might be surprised. So I know these days, especially, it's not viewed as being as sort of politically neutral as chatting about the weather, but I think it could be, especially if you use weather as the entry point for that conversation, which is kind of my whole uh, MO with Weather West and a lot of the public engagement that I do. A lot of what I talk about is actually the weather, but it turns out it's actually a conversation about climate change in retrospect because we live in a changed climate and all weather exists in the context of that changed climate. But what is the initial entry point for that conversation? It's usually individual, episodic weather events that people are personally experiencing. So no one's going to deny that it's raining outside right now or that today it's hot. Well, that's another story. But generally speaking, that's an easier conversation to have. And I personally use those things as entry points, and I think that other people certainly could as well.
A follow-up question, I think, to that very topic is um, one of the things I think we find frustrating in our world is the way in which the reporter is, bent over double against the hurricane and the driving wind, or is wearing a Nomex jacket in the face of, huge wildfires. It doesn't seem to acknowledge the fact that right now the greatest loss of life that is related to weather is caused by heat related emergencies. And those tend to be somewhat undramatic effects, and tend to happen not just it don't happen to entire neighborhoods, but to individuals, especially vulnerable individuals at the lower end of the socioeconomic, scale very often. So how do you, in your experience working with journalists, how do you shift them away from if it bleeds, it leads sort of mindset to get to the deeper parts of the story, the larger and more impactful causes and effects?
Yeah. Well, the honest answer is sometimes I don't, because sometimes we actually do, unfortunately, need those visual reminders if we're going to really have any chance of having the more nuanced conversations that follow. And so this is one of the reasons why, when there is a catastrophe, a wildfire or flood or, catastrophic hurricane landfall somewhere, those are the kinds of conversations that I try to have in those moments and saying, folks say, oh, now is not the time. Is that, of course, now is the time. Now is exactly the time to have those conversations, not to distract from the obviously critical task of responding to the short-term disaster and helping people and who need help immediately. But we have to be able to have these conversations at the same time that we do the things that need to happen in the short term to alleviate the short-term crises that emerge. And but you're right. There is this undercurrent with wildfire, even for example. So there's several ways of thinking about this. In the last 10 years in California, I actually just did this math for a wildfire seminar earlier this week. Over 260 people have been directly killed by wildfires in California. That's actually more than cumulatively in all California earthquakes in the past century. Uh, I was even surprised that number was so large. It's partly because we haven't had any, knock on wood, any really deadly earthquakes in a while in California, but it's a testament to the fact that the death toll is really high. But when you actually look at the numbers, what is the true death toll? Those are direct deaths associated with these fires. What is the true, morbidity and mortality associated with a given wildfire? It's actually likely in the hundreds or the thousands for exactly the kinds of reasons you mentioned, and for similar reasons that hundreds or even thousands of people can die in major heat waves, and we never hear about it. It's because these are people who were killed by the flames or the smoke directly in a very acute sense. It's people whose uh, pre-existing medical conditions perhaps were significantly exacerbated either by the persistent exposure to smoke, or the physiologic or emotional stress of evacuating or being in the midst of a disaster region. We see this unfold all the time. And there is now pretty compelling public health science that tells us that the death toll from Western wildfire smoke is likely in the four figures during major wildfire years. So those tolls dwarf these direct tolls from the fires themselves. Heat events are even more insidious in that sense, is that there's often no quote unquote direct death toll at all. And there are no flames. There are no buildings that go up in smoke and smoldering ruins behind. And yet, you know, there have been heat waves in even in wealthy countries in the past 20 years where more than 10,000 people have died. And it barely even made the news because it wasn't realized until years after the fact that there had been an enormous human toll. So I think talking about that full spectrum, one of the most recent things we were just talking about is how climate change is expanding the range of conditions like valley fever, which is caused by a fungus that grows in soil, is common in the desert Southwest, but expanding throughout the Central Valley of California in particular, also elsewhere. It has affected millions of people over the years, but it is a particular risk to people who work outdoors. So farm workers, construction workers, people who are incarcerated and don't have access to good indoor ventilation in dusty places. Uh, and this is another thing that is not necessarily a climate problem per se. I mean, obviously, this fungus has existed since long before we had Western cities, long before there was human-caused global warming. But its range appears to be expanding. There are a lot more cases in California today across a wider range of the state than there used to be. And this is another sort of example of these creeping, chronic, insidious things that aren't, dramatic. There aren't people keeling over in the street from valley fever. There aren't mass epidemics where everyone in a community gets it all at once in the same way there would be with the flu or something or COVID. Um, but it's another thing. It's another thing we're just sort of chipping away, where there's these chronic emergencies that can be really under-recognized and yet actually, in many ways, affect far more people than the ones we more commonly recognize do. And so I do try and have those conversations. I frame it essentially as I've just framed it now. There are these acute things that are dramatic, and those are important. There's also the things that are chronic and less visually and viscerally dramatic, but are just as important, if not more so, in the broader scheme of things.
Switching just back to a couple of specifically weather-related discussions. One of our audience asks about hemispheric circulation and projected extreme changes in that, i.e., the polar vortex. Um, do you see any sort of changes in that front that could amplify atmospheric rivers? Do you see wilder waves in the jet stream? How is all that playing out?
Yeah, so that's a that's the topic for about 20 different dissertations. This is sort of at the leading edge of climate science, where for as much as we understand about things like the expanding atmospheric sponge effect, which I do think is sort of a dominant way to think about a lot of what's going on, there's a lot we still don't know very well. And a lot of that relates to exactly the topics described here. So atmospheric circulation means essentially large scale global wind patterns that drive storm tracks. And we know these are changing in a warming climate. We don't fully understand exactly how, though, and this is kind of a problem. I'll give one specific example. The polar vortex is a bit of a different thing. By the way, there's a lot of use and misuse of the term polar vortex, but ultimately it's always there. It's not a new thing. The polar vortex is a vortex that exists at the North Pole. And sometimes it's stronger and sometimes it's weaker and sometimes it breaks down. Think of it kind of like a fence keeping the cold air in the Arctic. Occasionally it breaks down and a big lobe of cold air will blob over. This is, if you see it snowing in New Orleans like it did earlier this year when those lobes break apart. That has always happened. There's not as much clarity on whether that might be happening a bit more frequently in a warming world. It's not a dominant sort of reason why we're seeing major changes in California, but something that might be much more consequential for California in a similar vein are changes in El Nino La Nina cycles. So the El Nino Southern Oscillation is a natural oscillation in ocean temperatures off the coast of South America, so west of Peru, that affects global climate pretty significantly and can affect precipitation and storms in winter in California. For a long time, it had been projected that we would see a more El Nino-like condition in a warming world. So far, though, that's not what we've seen. We've actually seen a trend toward more La Nina-like conditions, and this essentially means a trend towards cooler water in the eastern tropical Pacific Ocean rather than warmer water. So here we come to a bit of an impasse. Are the climate models wrong? Because what we've seen in the real world is not what they said should be happening is circa 2025. Or are we essentially just experiencing kind of a random bad luck mode of natural variability? Essentially, is this just a random but unlikely experience? And the models are still right. We will eventually see that trend emerge. But right now, we're just kind of stuck in some unlikely uh, iteration of what could have happened. We don't know at this point. That's a pretty major uncertainty. Are the models wrong about El Nino or no? Or, as some of the most recent evidence suggests, it gets even more complicated. It might be that the long run, several decades from now, that they're essentially correct, that eventually this El Nino-like trend will eventually emerge and we'll see the precipitation patterns that we'd expect to see with that, but that we should have anticipated in the short term that the opposite would have happened. So essentially, in science, it might be called a non-monotonic effect, which is a fancy jargony word for saying it kind of went like this. So it went down first and then up. So instead of just going up and up and up, or down, 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 it does one thing and then another. So which of these is the truth? Which of these is going to turn out to be correct? I think one of them probably will. Those are really the three choices, I guess, that there are. But that's an example of an atmospheric circulation uncertainty that has major implications for California that we really don't fully understand yet. In fact, I would argue that we understand it less today. Our understanding of it is less certain today than we thought it was when I was, for example, getting my PhD like a decade ago. So uh, that's a place where our confidence has decreased. I'm quite confident in the expanding atmospheric sponge, but I can't tell you with what's going to happen to El Nino. And that is kind of concerning because it's a pretty important piece of the climate system.
Well, that answers a question that I think many of us have had when we've seen sort of early prognostications for El Nino over a couple of years that haven't panned out to be true, and that helps explain some of that. I want to close up our discussion today. I want to acknowledge that many folks had questions that were quite specific about interventions at the landscape scale. And I wanted to say to folks, I recognize that, and I wish we had time to really get into that. But I do encourage you to stay in touch with us because that's really the bedrock of our work. And we've a lot of answers to those questions that you're asking, especially around land use, around restoration, about wetland restoration, about water and aquifer recharge. So we're definitely ready to answer those questions. But I do want to again thank you, Dr. Swain, for above all, your work to make this intelligible, to communicate it clearly to people, and for sharing your time and expertise with us tonight. It's been incredible for us, and I think most of our audience really got a lot out of it looking at the comments. And hopefully we'll start making this a kitchen table conversation before long.
Well, thanks again for having me. Some really good questions, as you say, a lot of really good questions we didn't have time to get to, but as you mentioned at the beginning, I do host pretty frequent live question and answer sessions in the form of these YouTube virtual weather and climate office hours. And so many of these are sometimes I have ask me anything type sessions or topically focused ones, and a lot of these questions would fit quite well into that setting as well. Although I will also offer that when it comes to questions about land use, for example, where I'm getting a lot of my information is from folks like the people at the Land Trust. So I try and bring together these disparate sources of information, but ultimately, I often still think it's best to go directly to the source when you can.
Well, thanks, Daniel. Really appreciate your time, and we hope you have a great evening. And thank you, everybody else, for joining us. And look out for our next Language of the Land webinar.